Hello, and welcome to this reading of new work by bio members. Every year at the annual conference of Biographers International Organization, we invite members who have new work to read briefly, just for 3 minutes, from that new work. It's become a very popular event at our conference. This year, of course, we had to cancel the conference due to the coronavirus, and so I've invited the authors who would have read there to read from their homes so that you can enjoy the event in your home. There are 10 readers. All of them had books published between June 2019 and June 2020. And just by coincidence, all of the books are about women, ranging from Evelyn Wood, the speed reading queen, to Sylvia Plath, the famous American poet. I have arranged them in chronological order according to the birth date of the subject. Very good biographer fashion. And this range is just over a century, from 1827 to 1932. At the annual event at the conference, I feel that it's important for us to acknowledge the hard work that goes into every biography and also to celebrate the diversity of work that comes out of our organization every year and year after year. So I invite you to enjoy these readings with me. Thank you very much for watching.
Hi, folks. Thanks for inviting me to the Biosphere. My name is Jerry Mikorenda. I'm the author of America's First Freedom Rider, which is the story of Elizabeth Jennings and how she desegregated New York City's transit system 100 years before Rosa Parks, and thus gave rise to the early civil rights movement in New York City and in America. And what I'd like to do is read from the preface, which kind of goes into that, the reasons for that, and I call the preface Unheralded Labors, and I open it with a quote from Melville: "Truth uncompromisingly told will always have its ragged edges," and I'll just read a piece of it. This is the story of what happened that day. It's also the story about her family, the struggle for equality, and race relations. It's the history of America at its most despicable and its most exhilarating. Yet few historians know who Elizabeth Jennings was or what impact she had on desegregating the public transit system. Elizabeth Jennings' saga spans the breadth of American history, from the Revolution to today. The entire Jennings family used their skills to end slavery's grip on the nation. That grip couldn't have been stronger than it was in the 1850s. The Dred Scott decision, Roberts v. Boston, and the Fugitive Slave Act all painted a bleak picture for African Americans hoping to obtain their natural right to equal citizenship. The young attorney who defended Elizabeth, Chester A. Arthur, would become the 21st President of the United States. His fame brought a renewed interest in Jennings' old lawsuit. Unfortunately, rather than show how far the United States had come in its race relations, it illustrated just how far the country had fallen. Arthur and Jennings' lives paralleled and intertwined over the years before and after the trial that bound them together. The result holds a mirror to the norms of society that, to this day, values race and gender over all other attributes. Despite being born into poverty, Arthur rose to the highest office in the land. As a female of color, Jennings had to fight every day for some semblance of human rights. America's first freedom rider, Elizabeth Jennings, Chester A. Arthur, in the early fight for civil rights, brings together the cultural and historical events surrounding her life. It places national issues in the context of her time, her family, her story. It's an age not unlike our own, fraught with racism, partisan politics, and the struggles of marginalized groups to gain equal status. In an 1859 newspaper tribute that marked the passing of Elizabeth's father, Frederick Douglass wrote, "He was not an exception, but a representative of his class, whose noble sacrifices and unheralded labors are too little known to the public. This book is the total of many efforts over the years to bring those labors into focus as part of America's diorama, ragged edges and all. Thank you, and try the book. I think you'll like it. Thanks.
Hello. My book tells the story of Clara Colby, one of the leaders in the campaign to win the vote for women in America 100 years ago this year. Susan B. Anthony was a friend of Clara's, and she said about her that she was the finest writer in the women's movement. For that reason, I'm going to be reading from Clara's words, not my own. The article I'm going to read is at the beginning of the book and describes her memories of when she traveled as a child from England to America as a migrant in 1855. We've been tossing on the ocean for 3 weeks. Most of our number have become heartily tired of it during that time, but I, possessing a natural fondness for the water, and having escaped the disagreeable sensations generally attendant upon sea life, have thought every day too short. The boundless expanse of water was a mystery to me, and children love mysteries. So with a feeling something akin to that with which, in our pensive moods, we gaze towards the horizon, I have stolen away from my companions, and leaning far over the side of the ship, tried to learn the secret of the deep. We became pretty well acquainted in those days, the old ocean and I, considering this disparity of our years. My aged friend would listen patiently to the story of my childish griefs and soothe my troubled spirit by his gentle murmurings. But most of all, I loved the ocean in a storm. Setting aside the gratification of tumbling from one side of the ship to the other, of watching the terror-stricken faces, of listening to the noise and confusion of those running hither and thither. There is something awe-inspiring in the manifestation of so much power. And now the time is drawing near when we must part. For even at this moment, I hear a sailor from his lookout cry, "Land a-ho!" The words are echoed by every tongue, and all eagerly strain their eyes to catch a glimpse of the desired heaven. We go on deck, and from the poop we can see, faintly looming up before us as a cloud in the horizon, the lovely island of Staten. The air is balmy this morning. It is like the breath of sweet-tempered June, rather than that of impulsive, irritable May. We have suffered very much with the cold while passing the banks of Newfoundland. Only a few mornings ago, we could hardly stand on the deck for the ice, and now how things have changed. The face of the great ocean sparkles with joy and reflects undimmed the radiance of the sun. I cannot tell how Staten Island may appear on nearer examination, but certainly it is of surpassing beauty as the first object which welcomes us to the new world.
Hi, I'm reading the section of Free Thinker when Helen Hamilton Gardner's lover Charles Smart dies in 1901, and she learns that he has had a secret wife for 25 years. Gardner's situation grew more complex several weeks later when Smart's wife, Lavinia, resurfaced to claim that she was his rightful heir. Legally, of course, she was. Gardner recalled that she and Smart had written their wills together on the eve of their trip to California back in 1897, leaving everything to each other, and in the case of mutual demise, to Mary Phillips. When Gardner had announced plans to draft her will, Smart insisted on writing his too, though he owned nothing, Gardner remarked, except for some clothes and the watch she had given him. So after his death, when Smart's will could not be found, Gardner did not disturb herself about it. After all, she believed his will to have been a mere formality and done to satisfy his sense of dignity. But Gardner soon learned that Smart had drafted another will back in 1893. As Gardner was making her way home after dazzling audiences at the World's Fair in Chicago, Smart had made a secret trip to Charleston, West Virginia, to visit his family. While there, he filed a will naming his wife, Lavinia, as his sole heir. After Smart's death, Love appointed H.C. Bailey, her son-in-law, as executor, and sent word to New York that she had Smart's will in hand. With Gardner's reputation at its tenuous peak, Love's claim threatened to make public Gardner's 25 years of illicit cohabitation with Smart. Despite her strong public face, Gardner suffered another breakdown. Smart's death came just months after the deaths of Robert Ingersoll, her longtime champion, and John Clark Ridpath, her oldest friend. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had recently celebrated her 84th birthday, and Gardner knew that Stanton, too, was not long for this earth. Financially insolvent and broken in mind and body, Gardner placed her belongings in a spare room at the New York City home of the Ridpaths and left instructions for her trusted confidant, Mary Phillips, to reclaim Smart's belongings and sort out his tangled probate. Just as Gardner's adoring memorial to Smart was published in Free Thought magazine in March 1901, she was on her way to Puerto Rico to visit the Army hero who had recently planted the first U.S. flag on the island, Colonel Selden Allen Day, the very same man who had spoken about his Civil War experiences at her 1897 reading in San Francisco. 17 years had passed since Alice Chenoweth had emerged, like a butterfly from a cocoon, on the nation's stage as Helen Hamilton Gardner. More phoenix than butterfly this time, Gardner would remake herself once more.
So the one piece of context I wanted to give up front was to say that Kitty Hay is mentioned, and that is Gertrude Hoffmann's name as a child. She was Catherine Gertrude, went by Kitty, and Hay was her maiden name. Gertrude Hoffmann was a lifelong performer. She began her career in San Francisco in the late 1890s. She last appeared on stage in New York City in the 1930s. During this 40-year stretch, she sang, danced, choreographed, produced, and directed. Even after her long career had effectively ended, she still filled her journals with ideas for skits, monologues, and stage routines. These later diaries, some written while she was in her 70s, show a woman reflecting on the beginnings of her career, trying to follow back her extraordinary life to its inception. One was written in response to Edward R. Murrow's 1959 person-to-person interview with the playwright Moss Hart, in which Murrow asked Hart when he first knew he wanted to work in the theater. Hoffmann transcribes Murrow's question and Hart's reply. She then writes her response to the same question. She recollects seeing Ali Baba, or Morgiana and the 40 Thieves, a comic Orientalist extravaganza that toured the United States in the late 19th century. From the moment that curtain went up, she writes, Kitty Hay began producing in the theater. Hoffmann responds to the question someone else was asked in order to imagine herself as a part of that tradition. Throughout her life, copying gave her a way into the theater, and it helped her find her voice. She remembers seeing Ali Baba through a producer's eyes, understanding how and why different elements brought about different audience reactions. She perceived theatrical productions in terms of their total stage picture, as well as the component parts that made up the whole. They gave at least 3 ballets, she writes, about 40 or 50 girls, I began a mental photo of each ballet, costumes, details, all. Her near photographic recall of costumes and choreography would serve her well later in her career, when she made a name for herself as a mimic of stage personalities and as an imitator of dances she had seen in Europe. Hoffmann's career in the entertainment industry spanned decades that seemed like centuries, from Victorian pantomime extravaganzas and vaudeville through the rise of film, radio, and television. She learned how to imitate the most popular theater of the moment, a skill that served her well during her life, but led to her loss of reputation and near erasure from theater and dance histories. Now is the time for her reintroduction to the stage. In an era when remakes, remixes, and reboots dominate, we have room in our theater history for a woman who elevates imitation to an art.
Elizabeth Bowen lost her mother at the age of 13. She called it the unbearable year. In the summer of 1912, Bowen wrote, quote, "Florence, my mother, was told by a doctor, to her delight, that she would be in heaven in 6 months. Delight expresses her mother's relief after her many years of operations for cancer that had worn her out. The Colby family encircled Elizabeth Bowen, then 13, and she called it her unbearable year. Quote, I could not remember her, think of her, speak of her, or suffer to hear her spoken of. She never forgot the closeness, the physical intimacy with her mother, but no longer feeling, quote, her mother's cheek on her own, like Portia in The Death of the Heart, she said that she learned to live without her. This rent in Bowen's emotional life and the world was comparable only to her flight from Dublin to Kent, England in 1906 with her mother after the eruption of her father's mental illness. Bowen wrote little about her mother, though this was the central relationship of her young life, not only because of the devastation of this loss, but also because, as a writer, she mistrusted the genre of autobiography. She could approach her mother only through fiction, where she distanced and transformed the emotional state of motherlessness. Children in her novels, Portia, Leopold, Henrietta, Theodora, among others, experience, as she did, moments of sudden tragic importance. Young Henrietta feels, quote, as though a great dark plumed hat had been clapped aslant on her head in the house in Paris, after being exposed to Leopold's dark secrets and reminded of her own. In a quiet conversation, Leopold cruelly confronts Henrietta with her mother's death. Are you still unhappy about your mother? Leopold asks. Henrietta turns her face to the wall and demurs, quote, I'm not thinking of her. His taunting confirms the narrator's observation, quote, there is no end to violations committed by children on children. Leopold then announces that he does not remember his mother, but he will see her again. Henrietta, expert in hiding her feelings, quote, turned down her eyes, smoothed her dress, walked to the other side of the room, examining nothing, exhibiting only boredom.
The big stories of the 1961 National Education Association convention were supposed to be about federal aid to education and school desegregation. But a middle-aged teacher from Utah and her pubescent student grabbed the headlines instead. It was June 26th, the first real working day of the week-long event, following its official Sunday opening with the read-aloud of a message from President John F. Kennedy. At this point, the press area of the Atlantic City Convention Hall had produced plenty of soiled coffee cups, but few typewritten pages. JFK in absentia did not make good copy. Today's advanced transcripts of the evening speech by Jonas Salk seemed equally inauspicious. The legendary medical researcher had no new discoveries to report. However, the newshound soon found a suitable equivalent. Hard-nosed as they liked to seem, most journalists present were pushovers for a new brand of snake oil. The information explosion was in full swing, and millions of words were gushing out. Reporters and other professionals of the era were gripped with self-doubt. How could they keep up? The Atlantic City Convention promised a seaside cure, listed in the program as simply Wood Dynamic Reading Process, Evelyn N. Wood, Assistant Professor of Reading, University of Delaware. It was one of dozens of presentations offered to the 10,000 delegates in the cavernous convention hall. But Evelyn turned it into the main event. Short, middle-aged, and invariably described as a school teacher with all the dullness that implied, Evelyn played the part of MC before an audience of 150. The stars were two Wilmington, Delaware high school students trained by Evelyn in what she called her revolutionary reading method. Audience members were invited to choose a book from a stack of volumes never before seen by the youths. Each student in turn would have 3 minutes to tear through a section and report on the contents. A stopwatch ticked, and the audience gaped as 17-year-old Robert Darling ripped through 120 pages, running his fingers down each before turning to the next. He closed the book to deliver a detailed summary that drew exclamations from his dazzled listeners. He spoke for 15 minutes, 5 times as long as he'd spent reading.
This is the story of an artist whose life was irrevocably changed by another epidemic, polio. A 37-year-old painter from Virginia has become increasingly well known in the New York art world. Reviewers praise her work, represented by a leading gallery. The Whitney Museum of American Art purchased one of her recent paintings. Beloved by her friends, painters and poets mostly, she has flung herself into romantic entanglements with both men and women. Now she has finally saved up enough money from graphic design jobs to travel to the island of Mykonos in Greece. An artist friend has told her about the incredible quality of light and the low cost of living, and she's always up for adventure. She's amazingly energetic, freelancing by day, painting by night, and playing the drums at her famous loft parties. Even the way she paints, running up to the canvas to attack it with her brush, attests to her exuberance and vigor. Although it takes a while to get comfortably settled on Mykonos, her first studio is chilly and lonely, she soon meets interesting people. Months go by, and an artist friend in New York writes to complain jokingly that she never mentions even the tiniest negative thing about her impossibly wonderful life. In fact, something is troubling her. She has begun to feel strangely weak, too tired to paint. One day, she can no longer walk. A worried friend locates a German doctor, a fellow tourist, who finds that she has been stricken with polio. She will later learn that she has had the worst form of the disease, and doctors did not know if she would live. This is the biography of a leading artist who suddenly became a paraplegic. She would never walk again, never be able to run up to a canvas. Her right arm was significantly weakened. But she willed herself to turn the limitations caused by her disability into a positive force, producing landscapes and still lifes that became infinitely freer and more exuberant than her earlier work. Although she would exhaust herself to paint them, they reflect her continuing delight in the visual world and in being alive to see it. She would travel to far-off places, the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, Paris, the English countryside, and a mountaintop house in Austria, which provided enticing subjects for her art. And she would continue to share her intimate life with women, at first a young English nurse, and then an accomplished painter who remained at her side for her last 29 years. Strong-willed, bossy, ferociously competitive, and single-minded about her work, she was also loyal, tender-hearted, and a lot of fun. She led a life of passion and rage and joy, a life that has never been fully revealed until now.
Saved by her dolls. The only daughter of parents who found her a puzzling intrusion in their adult lives, Alice Adams entertained herself by making up stories about her dolls. She treated them as if they were characters in a novel. She deduced and accepted their own intrinsic natures, she said of her characters. She could see that some dolls were older and wiser than others, that certain dolls were simply vain and silly, that others were friendly and kind, that still others would probably laugh and have fun. She disliked dolls that came with ready-made names and stories, like Raggedy Ann or Shirley Temple. When Alice used a curling iron on the luxuriant red hair of Madeline, the doll suffered an unhealable blister on her pink plaster cheek and was left with scraps of hair too damaged to style. Shabby, pantalooned, and nearly bald, Madeline remained Alice's favorite. On long drives from North Carolina to Sebago Lake, Maine, where the Adamses spent summer vacations, Alice arranged the dolls she had chosen for the trip on the back seat of the family Chevy, while she crouched on the floor to attend to them. When the car slid off a slick, poorly banked curve into a ditch, Alice was said to have been saved by the dolls. She was 4, already practicing the art that would supply her vocation as a woman. The child who was saved by her dolls became a celebrated short story artist and novelist. Her work, editor Victoria Wilson said 7 decades later, was about the long pull towards clarity of desire and the ways in which people discover or keep themselves from discovering what they really want, can have, can become. The people in Adams' fiction grew from her own desire for clarity. The authorial voice in that fiction first emerged during her reign over her dolls. Watching and writing saved her over and over, first from her parents, then from the thrills and treacheries of her own romantic adventures and the entanglements that ensued. If writers can go to hell and come back, she speculated in a notebook, it's because part of them does not go, is watching.
In All the Horrors of War, I tell the story of 2 protagonists who converge in Bergen-Belsen, a hell, a concentration camp at the end of World War II. I tell their story over 1 year's time as Hugh Llewellyn Glyn Hughes, the liberator of the camp, and Rachel Guinness, a child survivor who was 15 at the end of the war, who is my mother, converge as they travel from the East and Western Europe to converge in this place in northwest Germany. The excerpt I'm about to read to you takes place 4 years earlier in 1941 when Rachel is 11 years old. In June 1941, less than a year after the Hungarian takeover of Szeged, the region she's from, the town she's from, the Germans invaded Soviet territory. In the ensuing chaos, anti-Semitic leaders decided to deport all foreigners, promising them a new life in Galicia. The National Central Alien Control Office would resettle those Jews who could not prove continual Hungarian citizenship for themselves and their ancestors going back 90 years. Though born and bred in Szeged, Rachel's Aunt Malchi and her Uncle Nachman had each lived away from the town. One July night, gendarmes stormed Nachman's home. They dragged the businessman to the police station. As he had lived in Palestine in the 1920s, Nachman was unable to produce papers verifying that he had continually resided in the area that was now part of Hungary. The next day, officers came for his wife and children. Rachel's Aunt Malchi, Uncle Mano, and their children, having lived for a time in Brasov, Romania's second largest city, were ousted from their home in the same terrible way. Among the several hundred foreign Jews thus rounded up and expelled from Siget was Moshe the Beadle, the synagogue caretaker. Several months later, he returned and told what happened. No one believed him, not even Elie Wiesel, his devoted pupil. "They take me for a madman," Moshe the Beadle told the young Wiesel. Freight trains had brought 16,000 expelled Jews from Hungary and 7,000 from Poland to a camp in Karamejo on the Hungarian-Soviet border. From there, trucks transported 1,000 a day to Kamenets-Podolsk in Ukraine. A few weeks later, the deportees were forced to march with the city's indigenous Jews to a forested area with large craters created by bombings. For 3 days, beginning on August 27th, the staff company of Friedrich Jacklin, SS police leader, assisted by a police battalion and Ukrainian auxiliaries, compelled their prey to undress and lie head to toe, sardine style, in the massive pits. They shot each man, woman, and child. Some were but wounded. The perpetrators made no effort to conceal their crime, the first large-scale Nazi massacre of Jews from the local population, many of whom saw the earth move up and down for days. Moshe the Beadle had taken a bullet in his leg and lay still as the drunken Nazis finished their work. In night, Elie Wiesel wrote, the deportees were soon forgotten. Days, weeks, and months passed. Life had returned to normal. Not for Rachel, not for her parents, not for her grandmother Chaya, whose stars had been taken from her eyes. This was why, since the summer of 1941, either Rachel or her sister Elizabeth slept beside their grandmother, who cried herself to sleep. Rachel's heart ached. Had something terrible happened to her aunts and uncles and to her 5 little cousins? Would she ever see them again?
On February 4th, 1963, a week before she took her life, Sylvia Plath wrote a letter to Ruth Barnhouse, her therapist, presenting a précis of her predicament and a prognosis. Separated from her husband for 7 months, she was still working on a new independent life for herself. In line with Barnhouse's analysis, Plath had come to believe she had succumbed to an idolatrous love, identified in the Erich Fromm book, The Art of Loving. The therapist had urged her to read. The poet had lost herself in her husband, making him her idol and father. She described herself as wanting to emerge from the shadow of a man she had feared losing. But he made it harder for her with loving visits to her daughter Frida, and carrying on with Asia Leavell, his ad agency girl. With Ted Hughes lost, she sought some kind of daily ritual to take his place, calling this time after his departure as a growing out of this death. She described in effect a state of mourning, a stasis that had driven her down in a deep freeze that made it difficult to weather her suffering. Salvation might arrive in the form of her writing, the concentration that had steadied her, and the magazine and BBC commissions that had validated her disciplined professionalism. And yet she felt written on the edge of madness. She had a vision of the worst, including a return to a mental hospital. Sleeping pills and nerve tonics had kept her going, but she was scared to death. I should just pull up the psychic shroud and give up. Sliding out of control, she panicked, picturing herself in a pit, staring up at her terrible, self-sacrificing mother on one side and her beautiful babies on the other. Plath took the blame, confronting a cold, accusing wind. She could hardly dress herself or make meals or even move. Her absent husband, the other woman, her mother's fearful anxiety, the cold, her self-induced freeze, her aloneness, the children. How had it all devolved into this terrible moment of hovering despair when she turned once again to Barnhouse? What happened during her last fateful week in February?